Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 726, and today is December 12th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We have a lot of important news to get through on today's show, but first want to remind people that the brand new Kyle Anzalone show just released its fourth episode. A new episode was out Wednesday this week. I think you're really going to like it. I break down the situation in Syria, a lot of comments from top officials, Joe Biden, Benjamin Netanyahu, members of Congress, the Washington Post, the New York Times. So what is the U.S. mainstream media saying about Al-Qaeda winning the war in Syria? I break all that down on the Kyle Anzalone show. So head on over, check that out, subscribe to the show. It is the top link in the show notes, so it's very easy to find. All right, everyone, let's jump right into this. First story up here today is from our pal Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Ukraine fires more U.S. ATACMS into Russia. Moscow now vows a response. So the Russian Defense Ministry said Wednesday that Ukrainian forces had launched another attack on Russian territory with U.S. provided Army tactical missile systems, which have a range of 190 miles. The Russian TASS news agency reported that Ukraine delivered the strike by 6 U.S.-made ATACMS long-range ballistic missiles at the military airfield in Tregorog in southern Russia on the morning of December 11th. The report said 2 of the missiles were intercepted by air defenses and the other 4 were deflected by electronic warfare. The Russian Defense Ministry says shrapnel from the missiles caused injuries. There are injuries among those personnel as a result of the fall of the fragments. There is no destruction while minor damage, which caused 2 buildings on the airfield's technical premises, 3 military motor vehicles, and also a civilian car parked in the parking lot adjacent to the airfield. The ministry also vowed there would be a response. The statement from Russia said, "This attack by Western long-range weapons won't be left unanswered, and corresponding measures will be taken." Last month, President Biden authorized Ukraine to use ATACMS, and Britain authorized the use of Storm Shadow missiles for long-range strikes inside Russian territory, despite Moscow making clear the steps would risk nuclear escalation. Russian President Vladimir Putin formally changed Russia's nuclear doctrine in response, lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. In response to the previous ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes in Russia, the Russian military launched a new intermediate-range ballistic missile into Ukraine known as the Oreshnik. The missile was not believed to be carrying explosives, but did significant damage nonetheless, and Putin referred to it as a test launch. A strike with a conventionally armed Oreshnik could do major damage, as Putin has suggested the weapon could replace Russia's nuclear deterrent. It would be that effective on the battlefield, especially even with a conventional warhead, where the first one they carried out didn't have a warhead whatsoever. It was just the kinetic effect from the Oreshnik that caused that damage. So we will see what Russia does next, but I do think we're going to see a major response from the Kremlin in the coming days. The Biden administration may believe that they have an absolute green light to act in Ukraine until Trump takes office, because they believe that Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin's puppet. But Putin knows that's not true, and so he is going to react to the U.S. escalations in Ukraine, even if there is a new administration coming in. All right, next one here, U.S. disburses $20 billion loan for Ukraine that will be repaid using Russian assets. So on Tuesday, the U.S. announced it dispersed a $20 billion loan for Ukraine that will be paid back with interest using frozen Russian central bank assets, a step that marks an escalation of the Western economic war against Russia. The $20 billion is a part of a $50 billion loan being provided by the Group of 7 nations, so that's the U.S. and its Western allies. You know, that extends a little bit beyond NATO when you're talking about the G7, because it includes the European Union, the major members of the G7, and then a few other countries that are in the Asia Pacific. And so the statement from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen explained these funds paid for by the windfall proceeds earned by Russians' immobilized assets, will provide Ukraine with critical infusion of support as it defends our country against an unprovoked war of aggression. The $50 billion collectively being provided to the G7 through this initiative will help ensure Ukraine has the resources it needs to sustain emergency services, hospitals, and other foundations of its brave resistance. And so there is a couple things I want to discuss about this loan. One, this is a part of the Western effort to Trump-proof the war in Ukraine. And so basically they are concerned that Trump would live up to his campaign pledge to end the war in Ukraine. And while we are doubtful that here on this show, particularly given Trump's cabinet pit and his appointment to be ambassador to the Ukraine conflict, Keith Kellogg, a real hawk and somebody who obviously just doesn't understand the war from his past statements. That's also something that I recently discussed on the Kyle Anzalone show, so you could find that episode on the page as well about Kellogg and Biden's appointments being hawkish on Russia, or Trump's appointments being hawkish on Russia. But back to this story here. What they're doing is they have about $200 billion to $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. And they are saying that we're going to provide Ukraine with a $50 billion loan. And then as the interest comes in off of the $200 to $300 billion, we're going to take that interest and use it to pay down this loan. Now, I have real questions about the accounting and the finances here. And while it may seem sure the U.S. government must know what it's doing, they would be able to pay back this loan in a reasonable amount of time, say, less than 10 or 15 years or something like that. It seems to me that if you kind of just do some basic math, and that if you're trying to pay down a $50 billion loan, which should be accruing its own interest, you would assume, with the interest off of a $200 billion loan, that's going to take a significant amount of time to do. I mean, anybody with a home loan and a mortgage probably understands this. Paying off these big loans take a lot of time. Now, maybe the U.S. is offering this loan at very low interest or interest-free. Maybe the European partners are doing that as well. I doubt it. And in a sense, I don't think it really matters. So it would only matter if Russia didn't care about the interest. If, say, a decade from now, the West unfroze the Russian assets and Moscow was happy just getting their $250 billion back, not getting, we're talking about $50 billion being paid towards Ukraine here. So, we're talking about a significant chunk of money. We're talking about tens, if not more, billions of dollars that Russia is going to expect in interest. And that money is no longer available. And so that would mean that Western countries, Western governments would have to go into their own treasuries to get that money to pay off the Russians and to make good on the money that they owed Russia from freezing the Russian assets. And that would be a real political nightmare in the West. I would not want to be the U.S. president that had to tell the American people that we're taking $50 billion or $30 billion or whatever it ends up being out of American government funds to pay back Russia, to end sanctions and to normalize our relationship with Moscow. But that is what's going to happen when the Biden administration moves forward here. Now, one thing that is interesting about this is the loan didn't quite end up like the Biden administration wanted. They have been pushing for this loan to go to Ukraine, I guess directly from the U.S. rather than through the World Bank. And this is significant because money that the Ukraine gets from an IMF loan, they are not able to turn around and are at least not supposed to turn around and spend on weapons. Now, I do imagine that Ukraine is still collecting some level of taxes. And so, these funds are fungible, right? Where if Ukraine collects $20 billion of taxes and gets $20 billion from the U.S., well, they could take that $20 billion from the U.S. and use that for welfare, running government, providing basic communications equipment, repairing infrastructure, stolen through corruption. Of course, a lot of the money will go right into Zelensky and his government's own pockets. However, just looking at this, overall, if the Ukrainian government, again, collects a significant amount of taxes or is getting money from other sources, they would be able to use that money to buy the Western weapons, and then they would take this money and put towards the government resources. So I just want to bring that up because on the past in the show when I've been talking about it, I'm saying that Zelensky is going to use this money to buy weapons. I guess he won't use this particular money to buy weapons, but this money will free up other funds for him to buy weapons. Now, of course, I think this is all about Trump-proofing the war in Ukraine, right? So what they've done is they've given Ukraine and are trying to give Ukraine about $7 billion of weapons between November and January. And I think that's meant to set up Ukraine for 2, 3, 4 months to keep up the fight. That way, when Donald Trump takes office, he can't go to Kiev and say, if you want any more U.S. support, then you need to immediately engage in negotiations with Russia. I think Ukraine could reasonably say, well, that's nice, Donald, but we're going to be good for 3 months. So they could kind of drag their feet and play Donald Trump a little bit. And during that time, I guess Zelensky is going to come to the United States, and he's going to come to the United States with an absolutely massive check. Again, he just got $50 billion from the U.S. and our allies. And even if that money cannot go directly to weapons, again, other Ukrainian money can. And so I'm guessing he's going to come to the United States with a massive check, and Donald Trump is going to have to say to Zelensky, no, I am not going to sell you American weapons. And I don't see that happening. And so if Ukraine has $20 billion, $50 billion, say, to spend on weapons, I mean, that could certainly sustain the war for 12, 18 months, especially with our other partners, dropping weapons into Ukraine. Now, of course, there are other factors. Does Ukraine have the manpower? Can they keep up the fight? Can they keep up the morale in Ukraine? Those are all important factors, too, where even in a limited amount of American weapons don't actually put Ukrainian troops on the front lines. And so, there is that issue, that constraining issue, and not to say that this war definitely goes on for another 18 months. However, it does seem that Ukraine does have months and months and months of funding to continue to fight this war. And then by the time that finally ends, there, I'm sure, will be in the United States this entire time a massive political push, demands, hyperventilating in the American media and among America's political class. How could Donald Trump do this? How could he not support our ally? Doesn't he understand that the world international order is on the line? The American world order is on the line. Ukraine, freedom, democracy are all on the line. We can't allow Russia, a dictator just like Adolf Hitler, to take territory, because then other dictators all over the world will do it. And Vladimir Putin is going to take the rest of Eastern Europe, and we're going to basically be in this Cold War against the Soviet Union once again, with Vladimir Putin on the throne in Moscow if Donald Trump does not continue this war. And that is going to be a lot to withstand. And we saw during the first Trump administration, he was not able to withstand the pressure related to Russiagate. And ultimately, despite all of his rhetoric about scaling back American involvement in NATO, getting along better with Russia, signing new deals with Russia, working with Russia, say, in Syria, none of that happened. None of that happened. And what actually happened is Donald Trump expelled a record number of Russian diplomats. Donald Trump put massive sanctions on Russia. Donald Trump took a step that Barack Obama was unwilling to and started sending armed weapons, lethal weapons, Javelin, anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. And so the idea that Trump is just some Putin puppet is absolutely absurd. And I think there's a real threat that we have to watch out for, that this scheme to Trump-proof the war in Ukraine is actually going to work. Now, one last point I want to make on this, and that is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton and the Democrats have been telling us over and over and over and over again for the past, decade, that Donald Trump presents a unique threat to democracy and that he's going to circumvent the will of the American people. And that's why he must be stopped, because we have to have democracy in America. Well, America, the democracy, just went out. Trump won the popular vote in what was one of the main differentiating issues between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on the campaign trail. Well, I mean, it wasn't healthcare. It wasn't a look back at the COVID lockdowns and the attempted vaccine mandates and things like that. No, one of the real issues between the two candidates, I mean, there are others, immigration, economy, and inflation, that all weighed heavily on the campaign, but the war in Ukraine was one of the real places where the two candidates had different opinions. And now you have the party that claims that we just respect and uphold democracy doing everything they can to circumvent the will of the American people, to prevent the will of the American people to end the war in Ukraine. We are done with this conflict. We are done with this proxy war. We understand how dangerous it is. We understand we are too broke to continue to fight it. And my guess is actually many Americans probably understand that the American arms stockpiles are being depleted to fight this war. This is not in the benefit of America or the American people. And so they turned against this war. They are done with this war. They want the war to end. And it's the Biden administration, or what during the first Trump impeachment, Alexander Vindman called the interagency policy. They say that there is a interagency policy, a establishment foreign policy, or the deep state foreign policy that even the elected president, the commander in chief, the people that the Americans put in charge of our military are not actually the ones that are supposed to be in charge of crafting our foreign policy. All right, let's move on and talk about the situation in Israel. First up here, this article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on December 11th. Haaretz uncovers 4 Palestinian deaths during Shin Bet interrogations since October 7th. So the Israeli outlet Haaretz has found that at least 4 Palestinians have died while under interrogation by the Shin Bet over the past year. Since October 7th, Israeli officials have touted the worsening conditions for imprisoned Palestinians, while human rights groups have reported that Israelis have tortured the detainees. According to Haaretz, one of the dead is Elad Rasidi. He is the former director of the women's hospital in Bet Lehiah. While Tel Aviv claims the doctor died of a heart attack, his body shows signs of beatings. Israel cleared him of being guilty of any crimes, and none of the 4 that have been killed during interrogations have officially been accused of a crime. And so these are innocent people that are dying during these interrogations. And while the Haaretz article is very careful not to say that they were tortured, it's pretty clear that that's what we're talking about here, right? People being beaten to death during interrogations. Yes, maybe this is an old man and ultimately it's his heart that gives out, and that's, what caused him to die. But ultimately, right, it's the beating, the interrogation, the mistreatment in these detentions that's causing it. So authorities in Tel Aviv have not recommended charges against any of the Shin Bet guards or interrogators who oversaw the dead detainees. It was previously reported that 11 Palestinians died in Israeli detention during the first 8 months following the October 7th attack. So that's from October to July of 2024 that there were 11 deaths. And the Haaretz article says that, there's not names for those 11, but I guess there's other identifying information, and none of it seemed to match with the other 4 that died. So that pushes the total death toll up to at least 15. Of course, the true death toll is likely higher than Israel is admitting. A lot of these people, their families have no idea what happens to them. They just get abducted from somewhere in Gaza, and then they end up in one of these Israeli torture dungeons for 3, 6, 9 months, and then they get dropped back off in Gaza at some time in the future, often with no clothes, completely disoriented, malnourished, and so the number of people dying in these detention facilities could be far, far higher. That Palestinians are dying in Israeli detention is unsurprising. Israel National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has routinely bragged that he has made living conditions for Palestinians in detention miserable. He has even suggested executing Palestinian detainees to make room for more inmates. Whistleblowers, mainstream outlets, and human rights organizations have accused Israel of systematic medical neglect, beatings, and sexual abuse of prisoners. Videos have surfaced from Israeli detention centers showing showing inmates humiliated, tortured, and neglected. Additionally, a video emerged showing a Palestinian being raped by their captors. Since October 7th, Tel Aviv has rounded up thousands of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. And so this is just absolutely horrific. All right, moving on next. This one from Dave DeCamp. Report: Ukraine sent drones and drone operators to HTS before offensive that ousted Assad. So Ukrainian intelligence had provided Harit Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, an offshoot of al-Qaeda, with drone support weeks before the al-Qaeda-linked group launched the offensive in Syria that ousted former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. So this was written in the Washington Post by David Ignatius. Quote, Ukrainian intelligence sent about 20 experienced drone operators and about 150 first-person view drones to the rebel headquarters in Idlib, Syria 4 or 5 weeks ago. So while the U.S. has celebrated Assad's downfall, HTS is still listed by the U.S. as a foreign terrorist organization, and its leader, Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, has a $10 million bounty on his head. That means Ukraine has supplied weapons and intelligence support to a group the U.S. considers a terrorist organization. Ukrainian and Russian reports have also reported that a special unit of Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, or the GRU, has provided support to HTS and was involved in some attacks on Russian bases in Syria. So the Russian ambassador to the UN said after the HTS offensive started, Ukrainian military instructors from the GRU are training HTS fighters for combat operations. The GRU has received significant support from the U.S. over the years. The Washington reported last year that the CIA's buildup of the GRU and the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, following the 2014 coup that ousted former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, was heavily influenced by the U.S. The GRU was our little baby. We gave them all the new equipment and training, a former U.S. intelligence official who worked in Ukraine told the Post. The GRU has also been involved in fighting Russia's Wagner Group mercenary forces in Africa. In Mali, the GRU provided support in July for an ambush that killed 84 Wagner operatives and 47 Malayans. And of course, there too, the rebel group is Jamaat Nasrallah al-Islam wal Muslimin, and that is an affiliate in the Sahel of Al-Qaeda. And so once again, we see these very close links between Ukraine and terrorist groups. And this is something, by the way, that a lot of us have been warning about through this entire war in Ukraine, is that the U.S. is sending the Ukrainians this massive amount of weapons. And we're saying, where else are these weapons going? Where else are they being siphoned off to? Who else is getting some of these arms? And now we're seeing time and time again that it's absolutely the worst case scenario. It is the terrorist groups that are receiving these weapons. All right, now let's update the situation in Lebanon. Israeli strikes kill at least 5 in southern Lebanon as ceasefire violations continue. So this is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Israeli ceasefire violations against southern Lebanon continued on Wednesday, with airstrikes reported in the region. The Lebanese health ministry report that at least 5 people were killed in the strikes. So Israel continues to carry out daily airstrikes and artillery attacks against southern Lebanon. Most recently, Israel has started expanding these strikes more widely across the nation. This is in spite of a ceasefire which has been in effect for over 2 weeks and has largely been observed by Hezbollah. There are so many Israeli attacks in southern Lebanon that some Israelis have expressed concern that the multiple loud explosions. In response, the IDF issued a statement reassuring Israelis that the explosions they hear are in the Upper Galilee, are a part of controlled detonations being carried out on Lebanese territory, and are no cause for concern. While there may be some controlled demolitions going on, that are close to the Israeli part of the Upper Galilee, so the noises are likely the sound of the war continuing. The future of the ceasefire is in doubt, as Israel has killed at least 30 since it began, and the IDF shows no sign of slowing down the strikes. In fact, if anything, to me, it seems to be escalating, and this is even as Israel is absolutely pummeling Syria. So next up there, Israel says it launched 480 strikes in Syria since fall of Assad. So this one, Dave DeCamp, December 10th, antiwar.com. I do believe this number is over 500 now, but this article really gets into the bulk of what Israel is doing in Syria. So the Israeli military said Tuesday that it launched 480 strikes in Syria over the previous 48 hours, which Israeli media said marked one of the heaviest bombing campaigns of by Israel in Syrian history. So some of the largest Israeli strikes in history on Syria. The IDF said it struck most of the strategic weapons stockpiles in Syria and estimated destroyed 70 to 80% of the former government's weapons. Israeli strikes hit targets across Syria, including in the port of Lakata, which destroyed naval vessels. The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the Israeli bombing campaign destroyed the most important military sites in Syria, including Syrian airports and their warehouses, aircraft squadron, radars, military signal stations, and many weapons and ammunition depots in various locations in most Syrian governorates. Israel has also seized territory inside Syria, a buffer zone separating the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights from the rest of Syria, and several areas beyond the buffer zone. Sources told Reuters that Israeli forces have advanced 10 kilometers into Syrian territory and were only 25 kilometers away from Damascus. Israeli sources denied that Israeli troops have advanced that far into Syria, but also announced they were creating a sterile defense zone in southern Syria, framing the occupation as temporary. The U.S. has backed Israel's land grab in Syria, claiming it was a defensive move. The Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz explained, together with the Prime Minister, I have instructed the military to establish a sterile defense zone free of weapons and terrorist threats in southern Syria without a permanent Israeli presence. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Tuesday claimed Israel didn't seek to interfere in Syria's international affairs, despite the massive bombing campaign and land grab. He also threatened that Israel would take more action if the new government allied with Iran. And so far, the new government of HTS seems more interested in aligning itself with Israel and the other Sunni states and against Iran. So, who knows kind of how this develops in the future. Now, we also have some major fighting breaking out in Syria between the SDF and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, the SNA. Of course, portions of the SNA are these al-Qaeda groups. So according to the report, a U.S. brokered ceasefire between the SDF, those are the Syrian Kurds, and the SNA that involved the Kurds withdrawing from two areas east of the Euphrates River. The SDF was violating that agreement by maintaining its hold on Manbij and was encircled by SNA fighters who were backed by Turkish air power. SNA fighters were also advancing east of the Euphrates River. And so in a lot of these areas of Syria, the Turks are more concerned, not necessarily about Assad or were concerned about Assad or Iran, Hezbollah. Their top concern was the American support and our backing of our Kurdish proxy force in the region that created a semi-autonomous Kurdish state that held a lot of important Syrian territory. And Turkey has continued to wage attacks on that territory. So the report said U.S. officials were exasperated by the SDF's refusal to head east of the river. The U.S. threatened that the U.S. military would no longer protect the SDF if it didn't comply, prompting the Kurdish forces to withdraw and cede the territory to the SNA, which is mainly comprised of Sunni Muslim groups. Now, I do imagine that this is going to be one of the things that people in Washington use to argue that we need to keep this war going. I think Lindsey Graham, we're already hearing this from him, and this is something I wrote down on the latest episode of the Kyle Anzalone show, which is he says that we need to prioritize protecting our Kurdish allies in Syria, which means waging war against our NATO ally Turkey and their al-Qaeda proxy force in Syria. So I don't necessarily think that too much of that is going to happen, but there's going to be a lot of agitation for it anyways. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Again, remember to head on over and subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. That's really going to help me out. I can now say that hundreds of you have already done it, and I really appreciate it. So help me out, subscribe to the new show, and be sure to watch the latest episode, because I think it's really one of the best episodes of any show that I've ever recorded. I'm very, very proud of that show, and I think you all will really enjoy it. So thanks, everyone. We'll be back with another episode tomorrow.